The Ashcombe estate sat at the edge of a quiet countryside village, where the river curved like a silver ribbon and the air smelled faintly of pine. Once it had been a place filled with laughter-soft music drifting from the parlor, the scent of baked bread in the mornings, the echo of a child's giggles down the marble hall. But that was before Isabel died. Nathaniel Ashcombe had not stepped beyond the estate gates since her funeral. The townsfolk spoke of him in hushed tones. The handsome man who had once lit up every gathering now lived like a shadow, his face pale from grief, his voice scarcely heard. The servant said he moved through the house as though afraid to wake ghosts. His daughter, Clara, was only 4 when her mother passed. Her curls were the same chestnut shade as Isabel's, her eyes a mirror of her father's, but lately those eyes had lost their light. She would stand by the nursery window, clutching her doll and whispering to it as if it could carry her words to heaven. She promised she would come back, she once told the maid, her tiny voice trembling. She promised. Then there was the baby, Thomas. Barely a few weeks old when tragedy struck, he had no memory of his mother's lullabies. Nathaniel tried to hold him, to feed him, but the child often cried in his arms. The sound of it hollowed him out from within. He had once been a man of action, confident, decisive. Now every decision seemed unbearable. Even the simple act of choosing a caretaker for his children felt like walking barefoot across glass. But he had no choice. His housekeeper, Mrs. Penmore, insisted one cold afternoon, "Sir, the children need more than a nurse. They need care, affection, warmth. Someone must tend to their hearts, not only their hands." Nathaniel stared at the dying fire. "And where, Mrs. Penmore, do I find such a person?" She sighed. "We shall try, sir. I've sent word through the parish. Over the following weeks, women came and went. Some stayed a day, others only a few hours. Clara made sure of that. She refused to speak to them, hid under tables, sometimes screamed if they tried to brush her hair. One nanny had even left in tears, declaring the child unruly and spoiled beyond saving. Nathaniel scolded Clara gently afterward, but she only crossed her arms and whispered, "They're not her." And in that moment his anger melted. For wasn't he just as guilty of the same longing, holding on to a ghost that would never return? Winter crept in. The air grew sharp, the garden silent. Nathaniel spent his evenings in the study, staring at the portrait above the hearth. Isabel, painted in spring light, holding Clara on her lap. She looked so alive it almost hurt to look at her. One morning Mrs. Penmore entered with a folded letter in her hand. "There's another candidate, sir, from the neighboring parish. She comes with a recommendation from the vicar's wife. Her name is Elara Wynne." Nathaniel sighed, weary of the endless cycle. "Very well. Have her come." When she arrived 2 days later, she did not bow or flutter like the others. She simply curtsied once and met his gaze directly, calm, composed, with a kind of strength that didn't need announcing. She was not young, though not old either, perhaps in her late 20s. Her dress was plain but neat, her hands roughened slightly by work. Her hair, a warm shade of auburn, was tied back without fuss. Nathaniel's first thought was that she didn't look the part of a governess at all. His second thought was that she didn't seem to care whether she did or not. "I understand you've had trouble keeping help," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. Nathaniel blinked at her bluntness. That would be one way to put it. "I don't scare easily," she said. glancing briefly toward the staircase. "May I meet the children?" Something in her tone, direct yet gentle, made him nod before he realized it. She found Clara sitting on the nursery floor, building a small fort out of wooden blocks. The little girl didn't look up. Alara knelt beside her. "That's a fine fortress you're building," she said softly. "But it looks lonely without a gatekeeper." Clara frowned. "I don't need one. Even the bravest castles need someone to guard the doors," Alara replied, placing one of the fallen blocks upright. Clara looked at her then, suspicious, curious. "The others said my room was too messy." Alara smiled faintly. "The others sound dreadfully boring." From the doorway, Nathaniel watched. It was the first time in months he'd seen Clara respond to anyone with more than silence or tears. By the time Alara left the nursery, the baby was asleep in her arms, something even the most experienced nurses had failed to achieve. Nathaniel stood there, unable to find words. "I'll take the position if you'll have me," Alara said, gently laying the baby in his cradle. "But I don't abide by foolishness or pity. I'll keep the children well, and I'll expect the same respect in return." Nathaniel blinked again, almost startled by her composure. "You speak as if you're the master here." Her eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "Only of the nursery, sir." And just like that, without a flutter, without a promise, Alara Wynne became part of the Ashcombe household. What Nathaniel didn't know then was that her arrival would do more than mend a home. It would awaken hearts that had long forgotten what it meant to feel alive. The first morning Alara Wynne began her duties, the house seemed to hold its breath. The servants watched from corners as she climbed the grand staircase with a stack of freshly laundered linens balanced in her arms. She did not wait for instructions. She did not ask where things were kept. By midday she had rearranged the nursery so that sunlight pooled across the children's play corner, and the damp chill that had lingered for months was gone. When Mrs. Penmore asked what she'd done, Alara replied simply, "Opened the windows." "The air in this house has been grieving too long." The housekeeper blinked, then smiled softly. "You've courage. I'll grant you that." That evening, Nathaniel came home from town to find Clara sitting at the dining table, eating her supper without fuss. It startled him. For months she had refused nearly every meal unless bribed or begged. Now she was quietly spooning stew into her mouth, while Alara read aloud from a children's tale about a knight and his talking horse. Clara looked up briefly as her father entered, but said nothing. Alara merely nodded in acknowledgment and continued reading. Nathaniel sat across from her, pretending to review estate letters, but his eyes wandered. There was something steadying about her voice, low, clear, with no trace of performance. It was the kind of voice that soothed without trying to. When the story ended, Clara said softly, "Again, tomorrow," Alara replied. "Stories are like sugar. Best taken in small pieces or you'll spoil your taste." The little girl frowned but obeyed. Nathaniel almost smiled. That became their rhythm. Alara rose before dawn, tended to the children, oversaw their lessons, took them for walks through the orchard. She did not fill the silence with chatter. She simply made presence itself feel like peace. Nathaniel noticed that Thomas, once fretful and sleepless, now rested soundly. Clara, though still guarded, began to laugh again, small bursts at first, like forgotten melodies returning. And yet there were moments when Alara's eyes clouded over, when she thought no one was looking. A shadow of memory, perhaps. She carried it, quietly the way one might carry an old wound that still ached when it rained. One afternoon, Clara threw a tantrum. She had been playing in the garden when she found a trinket, a silver hairpin that had once belonged to her mother. She clutched it tight, refusing to let go even as Ilara gently tried to take it, fearing she might prick herself. "It's Mama's," Clara shouted, tears streaming. "You're not her." "You'll never be her." The words hit like stones. For a long moment, Ilara said nothing. Then she knelt, her expression calm, her voice even. "No, I'm not your mother," she said softly, "and I wouldn't dare try to be. But I can keep that pin safe for you, until you're old enough to wear it yourself." Clara blinked through tears. "You won't throw it away?" "Never," Ilara said, holding out her hand. "You have my word." Slowly, the child handed it over. Ilara wrapped it carefully in a small handkerchief and placed it in Clara's toy chest, right beside her favorite doll. Nathaniel had watched the entire exchange from the terrace. Something in his chest stirred, something like gratitude or perhaps awe. Later that night, when the house was quiet, he found Ilara in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, washing the children's cups by lamplight. "You handled her well today," he said quietly. "She didn't turn." Children don't cry for the sake of being difficult. They cry because they've lost something they don't know how to name. He leaned against the doorway, studying her in the flickering light. "And what of you, Miss Wynne? Have you lost something too?" For a moment her hands stilled. Then she said, "Everyone has, Mr. Ashcombe. Some of us simply learn to live with the echoes." Their eyes met, and the silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy with unspoken understanding. From that night on, he began to notice her more keenly. The way she tucked Clara's blanket just so, the faint hum of a lullaby as she worked, the gentleness she showed even when she was stern. But Ilara was not meek. When Nathaniel once scolded Clara too sharply for muddying her dress, Ilara spoke up without hesitation. "She's a child, not porcelain," she said, eyes steady. "Grief already took her mother. Don't let it take her laughter too." He stared at her, half in shock, half in shame. No one had dared speak to him like that since Isabel's death. Later that evening, when the children were asleep, he found himself at the study window, thinking of her words. She was right, of course. But more than that, she was the first person in years who had reminded him what truth sounded like. He did not know then that this quiet defiance, this fierce tenderness, would begin to change everything, because the house that had once echoed with sorrow was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to hum with life again. And it was Ilara Wynne, the woman who would not leave, who was teaching it how to breathe. Spring came gently that year. The last traces of frost melted from the garden walls, and the air filled once more with the scent of apple blossoms. For the first time since Isabel's passing, Ashcombe House felt alive again, the sound of laughter echoing faintly from the orchard. Small feet running down the hallways, the piano's dusty keys touched once more. It was Ilara who brought music back into the house, not through grand gestures, but through the smallest, quietest acts. Fresh flowers on the table each morning, lullabies hummed by the window, sunlight filtering through open drapes that had long been kept shut out of respect for the dead. Mrs. Penmore, who had served the family for over 20 years, once remarked with a knowing look, "She's not just mending the children, sir. She's mending the house." Nathaniel said nothing, but he felt it too. There were moments when he would pause in the doorway of the nursery, Watching her as she read aloud to Clara, the little girl leaning sleepily against her shoulder, Thomas curled in her lap. The sight stirred something gentle, almost painful in his chest. But then he'd catch himself, guilt pressing in like fog. How could he? Isabel's portrait still hung above the mantel, her smile forever young, forever his. He had vowed to love her until his dying breath, and he did. Didn't he? Elara, meanwhile, noticed his distance, though she never spoke of it. She had long learned that love and longing were not always meant to be voiced. Her past was a quiet ache, one she carried like an old scar beneath her sleeve. Years ago, before Ashcombe, she had been engaged to a school teacher named Owen Holly. They'd grown up together in the same village. He'd had kind eyes, and when he smiled, it felt as though the whole world brightened. They'd planned to marry one summer, but then fever swept through the countryside. Within a week he was gone. Elara never spoke his name again. She had buried it alongside the part of her that once dreamed of family, of laughter, of home. After that she devoted herself to care of other people's children, other people's homes, as though nurturing what she could no longer have might somehow make the loss easier to bear. And yet, standing in the nursery at Ashcombe, she sometimes felt the ache soften. Clara's shy smile, Thomas's chubby hands reaching for her hair, they reminded her that love, even when borrowed, could still be real. One late afternoon, the three of them sat by the garden pond. Thomas, now toddling, tried to chase a frog and nearly toppled in. Elara caught him just in time, laughing breathlessly as she drew him close. "You," she scolded playfully, "will be the death of me." Clara giggled. "You sound like Papa when he says that about me." Elara smiled faintly. "Well, then, you're Papa, and I must agree on something." Nathaniel, standing a few paces away with a book in hand, looked up at the sound of their laughter. The sun was setting behind them, turning Elara's hair to copper flame. For a fleeting second he saw not the governess but a woman, warm, alive, full of quiet grace. When she noticed him watching, their eyes met. He gave a small, polite nod, but she held his gaze a heartbeat longer than custom allowed. It was the first time in years that silence between two people had felt ... alive. That evening, Clara tugged at Elara's sleeve as she tucked her into bed. "Miss Wynne," she whispered, "if Mama were here, do you think she'd like you?" The question startled her. Elara hesitated, then brushed a curl from the child's forehead. "I'd like to think she would. Your mother sounds like someone who loved deeply." "She did," Clara murmured sleepily. "Papa says I look just like her." "You do," Elara whispered. "And you have her heart, too, I can tell." Clara smiled faintly and drifted to sleep. Elara sat there a while longer, watching her breathe. There were moments, quiet, tender moments like this, when the ache in her heart felt almost like peace. Weeks passed. The bond between them deepened in small, unspoken ways. Clara began to follow Elara everywhere, copying the way she folded napkins or plaited her hair. Thomas would reach for her before anyone else. Even Nathaniel's cold study, once a place of isolation, now carried traces of warmth, a vase of wildflowers here, a drawing from Clara there. But the world beyond the estate had begun to whisper. Rumors reached the village. The widower's nanny is quite a beauty. They say he keeps her too close. Nathaniel ignored them at first, but gossip, like smoke, always found a way to seep through the cracks. One evening his business acquaintance, Mr. Lawton, raised the matter bluntly over supper. "You're inviting talk, Nathaniel, a young woman under your roof, unattached, attractive. It's only a matter of time before tongues wag." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "She's my children's caretaker, nothing more." Lawton smirked. For now, that night, as the house lay quiet, Nathaniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He told himself he was only protecting Alara's reputation, that he kept his distance for her sake. But deep down he knew the truth was more complicated. He was no longer afraid of dishonoring Isabel's memory. He was afraid of what would happen if he stopped. The next morning he found Alara in the garden, trimming the rose bushes. She looked up as he approached. "Mr. Ashcombe," she greeted, wiping her hands on her apron. "The children are in their lessons." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Miss Wynne, people have begun to talk about you, about us." "I'm aware," she said quietly. "Servants gossip. It's the price of being visible. You don't seem troubled." She met his gaze, calm and unflinching. "Because I know who I am, sir, and I know what this is, a home I've been trusted to care for. Nothing more." Her composure both steadied and unsettled him. "You've been more than that," he said before he could stop himself. Her breath caught, only for a moment. "Then perhaps that's what frightens you," she said softly. And with that she turned back to her roses, leaving him to the silence that said far more than words ever could. From that day on, something changed between them. The air grew heavier when they were near. Their glances lingered longer than they should. But neither spoke of it, because both of them knew some hearts break quietly before they learn how to love again. By early summer the roses bloomed higher than the garden walls. Pale blush and deep crimson tangled together in a quiet kind of rebellion. Inside Ashcombe House, however, something more fragile was beginning to unravel. It started with a visit. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, Nathaniel's elder sister, arrived one bright afternoon in a flurry of silk, perfume, and disapproval. She had always been the sort of woman who believed life could be managed with enough rules and ribbons. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, removing her gloves with a deliberate slowness. "Rumors, Nathaniel. You must understand the harm they can do to your reputation, to the children's." Nathaniel sighed. "Eleanor, there's nothing improper here." "So you say," she replied coolly, her eyes drifting toward the garden where Alara was playing with Thomas. The child's laughter carried faintly through the open window, light and free. "And yet one cannot ignore what people see. She's young, pretty, alone. You've invited trouble. She's the children's governess. That's all." Eleanor's lips curved in a thin, knowing line. "That's never all, dear brother." But beneath her calm, she could sense the woman's scrutiny, sharp and measuring. "You must find it lonely," Eleanor said sweetly. "Living here, so far from your family?" "I have the children," Alara replied softly. "And they've been more than kind to Indeed," Eleanor murmured, eyes flicking between her and Nathaniel. "Perhaps too kind." For days after that visit, the house felt different. Conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer. Even the children seemed to sense the change. Clara clung to Alara's skirts, asking if her aunt disliked her. "Oh, no, my dear," Alara said gently, brushing the child's hair. "She simply doesn't understand what we have here. Some people fear what feels too much like happiness." But when she said it, her voice trembled. Nathaniel, too, had withdrawn. Not out of anger, but from something heavier. He had begun to measure the distance between them, afraid of what would happen if it ever vanished completely. He spoke to her less at dinner, avoided lingering in doorways. Some evenings, when he heard her laughter from the garden, he would pause by the window, half wanting to join her, half wanting to flee. One night he found her there alone, sitting on the stone bench beneath the apple tree. Moonlight washed her face in silver. "You shouldn't be out so late," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "And yet you're here." He hesitated. "I didn't mean—" "I know." Her eyes met his, steady and kind. "You never mean to, Mr. Ashcombe. That's what makes it hurt less and more." He sat beside her then, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the pull. The night hummed softly with crickets and unsaid things. "Elara," he began, then stopped, the weight of her name on his tongue almost unbearable. "I never wished to make your life harder. You haven't," she said gently. "You've only made it harder to leave." The words hung between them like a confession neither had planned to make. He turned toward her, but she was already standing, her eyes glistening. "Good night, Mr. Ashcombe," she whispered. "Please don't follow." And he didn't. The next morning, Mrs. Penmore found Elara in the hallway with a folded letter in her hand. "Going somewhere, Miss Wynne?" the housekeeper asked softly. Elara managed a faint smile. "Just to the village. I thought it best to make arrangements in case Mr. Ashcombe feels my presence is no longer proper." Mrs. Penmore's brow furrowed. "The man would sooner burn his own house down than let you go, child. But he's too proud to say it." Elara said nothing. Pride, she had learned, was a quiet form of heartbreak. That afternoon, while packing the children's clothes for their summer stay by the seaside, Clara burst into tears. "I don't want to go without you," she cried, clutching Elara's arm. "You have to come." Elara knelt and held her tightly. "My darling girl, sometimes people must part even when they don't wish to." "Will Papa make you go?" Clara sobbed. Elara swallowed hard. "No, sweetheart. This isn't his fault. It's simply how things must be for now." From the doorway, Nathaniel stood silently, unseen. He watched Elara comforting his daughter, the tenderness in her voice, the strength in her trembling hands. It was then that he understood something cruel and simple. He had already fallen in love with her, not in the way he had loved Isabel. That love had been all sunlight and certainty. This one was quieter, built from shared grief and slow healing. He could not choose between them, not truly, for one was memory and the other was mercy. That evening he found Elara in the corridor, standing by the packed trunks. "Don't go," he said quietly. She froze. "Nathaniel?" He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've given my children back their laughter. You've given me back something I thought was lost forever. If people must talk, let them." Tears welled in her eyes. "And what of Isabel?" he exhaled shakily. "I will always love her. But love doesn't end where another begins. It changes shape." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And if staying means losing myself?" He looked at her for a long, painful moment. Then he said softly, "Then I'll let you go. But not because I wish to." The space between them felt vast, yet somehow full. A love too real to name, too fragile to claim. And so they stood there, two souls bound by the kind of longing the world could never quite understand. The sea had a way of softening everything, even grief. By autumn, The Ashcombs had taken residence in a small coastal cottage, far from the whispers of town and the heavy silence of their old home. The children adored it. Clara spent her days chasing shells along the shore, while little Thomas laughed every time the waves kissed his toes. But there was an absence still, a quiet ache that hung behind their smiles. Elara Wynne had left 2 months earlier, and though Nathaniel had said it was for the best, he had not known how large a space one woman could leave behind. Each night, after the children slept, he would walk along the beach alone. Sometimes he imagined her there, skirts lifted above the surf, hair loose in the wind, eyes reflecting the sea. And then he'd realize it wasn't imagination at all, just memory refusing to fade. One evening, Clara brought him a letter, creased, a little smudged by travel. "It's from Miss Wynne," she said breathlessly, eyes shining. "She wrote to me." Nathaniel's heart clenched as Clara read aloud, her small voice trembling with joy. "My dearest Clara, I hope you are keeping your father and brother well. Tell Thomas that I miss his laughter, and tell your papa that the roses will bloom again if he just lets the light in. I am staying by the sea now, helping with the small school. The children remind me of you. Sometimes when I hear the gulls cry, I think of home. Be good, my dear, and remember, happiness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without pain. Yours always, Elara." He folded the letter carefully when she was done, but that night he did not sleep. The next morning he made a decision. The journey to the coast was long, and the wind was cold enough to sting. But as the carriage crested the final hill, Nathaniel saw her, standing on the sand, guiding a group of children through their lessons, her voice carrying faintly over the wind. He stood watching for a long time before she noticed him. When she finally turned, surprise flashed across her face, then something softer, like the quiet recognition of a prayer once whispered in the dark. "Nathaniel," she breathed, "what are you doing here?" He hesitated, suddenly aware of how foolish his journey might seem. "I wasn't certain until now," he said, "but I had to see you, to tell you that the house feels empty without you, not because it needs another caretaker, but because we do." Her eyes glistened. "I told you once I couldn't stay." "I know," he said gently, "but I was hoping you might come home instead." Elara looked away, the waves curling around her shoes. "And what of your wife?" "Of her memory?" Nathaniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both love and peace. "Isabel taught me what it means to love without fear. You've taught me what it means to love without losing myself to grief. I think she would have wanted that for me." Ilara's lips parted, but no words came. The tide whispered at their feet, pulling and retreating like the ache between them. He stepped closer. "You don't have to answer now. I only wanted you to know that I'll wait as long as it takes." For a moment the world seemed to pause. The gulls cried overhead. The waves lapped at their ankles. And then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, tentative but sure. "I've spent so long trying not to need anyone," she said softly. "But you make it feel safe to begin again." He took her hand fully then, his thumb tracing the faint tremor in her fingers. "Then let's begin." Months later, Ashcombe House was alive again. Elara walked through its halls as the new mistress, not replacing Isabel, but standing beside her memory like one light beside another. Clara and Thomas thrived, their laughter echoing through rooms once silenced by sorrow. Sometimes when the children were asleep, Nathaniel would find Elara in the garden, tending the roses she had once revived. "Do you ever think of her?" she asked one night. Every day, he said, but it no longer hurts. Loving her and loving you, it's not choosing one over the other. It's remembering that the heart can hold more than we think. Elara smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of peace earned, not given. Then we are both lucky, she whispered, because I never thought love could come twice. But here it is, different, yes, but just as true. And as he drew her into his arms beneath the soft rustle of the roses, the night seemed to breathe with them, not with grief or longing, but with something gentler, something like home. And so the house that had once mourned in silence learned to live again, not through forgetting, but through love that was brave enough to stay and gentle enough to begin anew. Nathaniel found peace not in replacing what was lost, but in honoring it and realizing that love, when true, does not compete. It grows. And Elara, she who had once feared belonging, finally found herself rooted where her heart was seen, and her soul was safe. They did not chase perfect happiness. They built a quiet one, something steady and perfect and real. And when the wind passed through the rose garden at dusk, carrying laughter and lullabies into the evening air, it seemed to whisper what they both had come to understand, that love, when it returns after sorrow, is not a second chance, it is a resurrection. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that love, even after loss, can bloom again, not to replace what was, but to honor it and to begin anew.